I ask that question every day, and I never got an answer until today. Check, 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 check. Check, 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 check. 1, 2, 3, 4. Testing. 1, 2, 3, 4. Check, check, check. Where's my sound? 1, 2, 3, 4. Check, check. I have a feeling it's coming. Oh, there's your Zoom. There's Carrie. Yeah, there's my voice. 4.
Mic check, 1, 2. Mic check. 1, 2. It's good? All right, thank you.
In about 30 seconds. Check, check. It was coming through? We good? Cool. And then, yeah, put it back on
today about the original intent of the Constitution. To start our time, Dr. Sweeting would like for us to sing My Country 'Tis of Thee, and to pay really close attention to the wording. They are great words. So please join Dr. Menth and Dr. Nietzen as we sing. Amen, amen. Please be seated. Thank you. Let me pray before we begin. God, thank you for our freedoms. We take so many things for granted, but freedom, truly we are grateful that our country has freedoms, that Christ gives us freedom. We know from all of our Old Testament studies that people beg for a king, and they beg to be almost told what to do, and we are grateful that you give us a model on what it looks like to be free. Make us truly, truly grateful for the freedoms that we have. So God, thank you for these people. I do thank you for Colorado Christian University, that our platform in being Christian and Christ followers and Americans and socially caring about the freedoms and the Constitution and the things that we admire and respect in our country. So God, thank you that you have a place, unique place, where we're really talking about the biggest things there are to talk about. So God, thank you for our speakers today. I just pray for our CCU speakers. They have spent their careers being ready for this topic. This is what they talk about. So God, give them the right words to say, give them the energy to say it. And I just pray for our receptiveness as an audience. So God, thank you for this time. Thank you for months that honor cherries and chocolate and all of the things that make our world fun. So thank you for all of the blessings that you give us. And I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen, amen. Dr. Copeland, Tom Copeland is a new faculty member in political science, comes to us from Biola, where he has had a career looking really across the curriculum, political science, and in all kinds of interdisciplinary areas. Please come up and introduce our topic, our speakers, and welcome.
Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Strategic Objectives Workshop on the American Founding Documents and God. And it's an honor, of course, to have this opportunity to participate with my colleagues, Dr. Stewart and Dr. Ellis, and to initiate a bit of a conversation and some deeper thinking about a couple of our strategic objectives. Now, many of you are familiar with the most detailed of CCU's strategic objectives. Impact our culture in support of traditional family values, sanctity of life, compassion for the poor, biblical view of human nature, limited government, personal freedom, free markets, natural law, original intent of the Constitution, and Western civilization. Now, the big ideas in this list are separated by commas, but today we want to replace a comma with the word and, a biblical view of human nature and limited government. We want to talk about how the American founders understood fallen human nature and what effect that had and still should have on how important it is to have a balanced view of political power. Now, today's politics is full of isms, ideologies or movements that animate large numbers of people, but each of them is somewhat unbalanced. First of all, libertarianism. This is most often identified with figures like Rand Paul and Gary Johnson, popular here in Colorado. I think he won 9% of the vote in the 2016 election. Libertarians have essentially a positive view of human nature, that if you just leave people alone, they will do the right thing and work together for the common good. Now, when the floodwaters from Hurricane Harvey were overwhelming emergency responders in Houston, what happened? Thousands of guys from Louisiana drove their pickups and bass boats hundreds of miles to help rescue people. Nobody from the government ordered them to do it, and in fact, with their cell phones and GPS, these ordinary folks were very effective in rescuing people. So libertarians love this kind of spontaneous order. Libertarians also love freedom. And when they say freedom, they mean freedom from outside control. So the less outside control of your life, the more free you are. Now, this can be generally positive when thinking about limiting government influence in free markets, for example. The social libertarians extend this view to things like illegal drugs, prostitution, and more. Just leave people alone and we'll all get along. So I think a major problem for libertarianism is that it wants liberty without law, which is effectively a form of anarchy. And secondly, progressivism. Now today this is identified with people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. And they also have a somewhat unique view of freedom. Freedom to be all that you can be, like the old Army advertising campaign, but they know better than you do what you should be. So the philosopher kings of the intellectual elite naturally know what is best for everyone. For example, again, in New York City, several years ago, former Mayor Bloomberg proposed that the city restrict the size of soft drinks people could purchase. The argument was that excessive consumption led to obesity and increased costs to the government for medical treatment. So if you were going to be a good New Yorker, you needed to be healthy. And if you couldn't decide for yourself to restrict your intake of sugary beverages, the city would make the decision for you. Now, ultimately, the so-called big gulp ban was struck down by the New York Supreme Court for unconstitutional overreach in New York. Well, today the progressive view of freedom is now almost entirely taken over by identity. You're only truly free if you can fulfill whatever identity you desire. But this kind of expansive freedom requires a strong central government to get everyone into line. Force nuns to distribute contraceptives. Force cake decorators to endorse gay marriage. Force schools to open bathrooms to everyone. So a major problem, I think, for progressivism is that they want law without liberty, which is the definition of tyranny. And thirdly, populism. It's been identified in past decades with Ross Perot and Pat Buchanan, and today with President Trump. There can be a right-wing movement, like it is in America right now, or Europe, or a left-wing movement in places like Venezuela. And populism does not have a unified ideology. It tends to simply describe grassroots voters who are upset with elements of national politics. Populists distrust most governmental power, often feeling overlooked by powerful people, and their distrust and frustration are stoked by leaders who give voice to their anger. And populists tend to think that the general will of the people, as they understand it at least, should be the guide to policy. So populism has its own set of problems. It tends to be ahistorical. It's often not very thoughtful. It doesn't care a lot about evidence. It's probably overly distrustful of government. It's simplistic. And unfortunately, in many cases, people power can be easily manipulated. So foundational principles are being ignored by most of these isms. Conservatism claims to always go back to the foundational principles, ad fontes, as the reformers and Dr. Sweeting remind us. So how is conservatism different? Well, conservative principles were nicely articulated by a gentleman named Russell Kirk in the past century in a series of books and articles. Let me share a couple of what he says are fundamental conservative principles. First, conservatives believe in an enduring moral order. They have a strong sense of right and wrong and a concern that liberty must be ordered. And private morality must not be restricted only to the private sphere, but morality is implicit and necessary in all of society. Secondly, conservatives are interested in adhering to custom. They take what's worked in history and stick with it. So novel innovations and inventions in morality are often mistakes. Conservatives understand our fallen human nature. They know that we're fallen, and conservatives are therefore unlikely to follow utopian dreams. Conservatives believe in the importance of private property, having ownership over your own ideas and the work of your hands. And finally, conservatives believe in prudent restraints upon power. So Kirk said in one place, the conservative endeavors to limit and balance political power so that anarchy or tyranny may not arise. Constitutional restrictions, political checks and balances, adequate enforcement of the laws, the old intricate webs of restraints upon will and appetite, these the conservative approves as instruments of freedom and order. He concludes, a just government maintains a healthy tension between the claims of authority and the claims of liberty. So conservatism finds a solid basis for limited government, not the anarchy of libertarianism, nor the tyranny of progressivism. Ronald Reagan put it memorably, as he always did, when he said, the most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Now, he put it again more succinctly when he said, man is not free unless government is limited. Now, one of the blessings of liberty in America is constitutionalism. The fact that we have a written constitution, a structure for coordinating power, but limiting government so that we can enjoy our God-given rights, worship and serve God freely, and love our neighbors. The Founding Fathers combined their understanding of human nature and the enduring moral order rooted in the Christian West to assemble a government structure that enables human flourishing and freedom while still limiting political power. We get an insight into their plans from James Madison, who wrote much of the Federalist Papers, a series of newspaper editorials written to support the new U.S. Constitution. This is perhaps his most famous line. He said, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, in the next place oblige it to control itself. So Madison recognizes our fallen nature. We are not angels. He knows that while we are first of all a fractious and disobedient people who do need a government, we also are tempted to expand our power and control over others. So the founders obliged the new government to control itself by several means: a separation of powers, enumeration of the specific powers of each branch of government, and a balance of powers, or checks and balances. Now, although the founders drew their ideas from a close study of political history, this was such a novel idea, to limit government, balance it against itself, list its limited powers, and then to write the whole thing down. Well, I'm beginning to tread on my following speakers and getting ahead of myself a bit. Dr. Jenna Ellis is going to talk about the Constitution, but we need to start a bit further back than that yet. Gary Stewart will help us understand how the Declaration of Independence was both Christian and conservative. Then Dr. Ellis will talk about the moral foundations of the Constitution and its restraints upon power. So let me introduce my fellow speakers. Dr. Gary Stewart is an assistant professor of history at CCU. Prior to this, he was a pastor for 7 years in St. John's, Newfoundland, Canada. If I can depart from the text for a second, my office is across from Gary's. And I can't tell you how many times I have heard Gary speaking with students in his office and pastoring them and mentoring them. And it's just impressive to see. So thank you for that contribution to our students, Gary. Well, Dr. Stewart received his PhD from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, where his dissertation was on the American clergy's involvement in and justification of the American Revolution. Dr. Jenna Ellis is an attorney and constitutional law professor, and she's a fellow with Centennial Institute in Constitutional Law and Public Policy. She's also a conservative commentator in a variety of media, including Fox News and NBC, and is a contributing writer to the Washington Examiner, the Federalist, and National Review. She received her Juris Doctor from the University of Richmond School of Law. So please help me welcome Dr. Stewart and Dr. Ellis.
All right, good morning. My task this morning is to talk about the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution of which it was a part, and to help us understand some of the principles behind it. As I do so, I want to be aware of the Canadians that are in our midst this morning and be especially sensitive to their particular political proclivities. My only hope is that they don't adopt the posture of the Democrats at President Trump's State of the Union address on Tuesday night, and as I speak. So if I can avoid that, I'll be satisfied. I want to start by raising a couple of potential problems. I'll present these problems in the form of questions. Potential problem number one: should we as Christians be embarrassed by the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence? Should we be ashamed that the 13 British colonies came to be independent states by overthrowing their British political authorities? After all, doesn't Romans 13 and other places in Scripture instruct Christians with the following words, or words of similar instruction? Romans 13, every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. Isn't resistance rebellion and sin? Were not our founding fathers guilty of violating fundamental and straightforward Christian teaching? Well, this is in fact what many Christian theologians, historians have in fact argued. John MacArthur, to name one, and I normally appreciate and agree with lots of things that John MacArthur says, but he says this as following: the United States was actually born out of a violation of New Testament principles, and any blessings that God has bestowed on America have come in spite of that disobedience by the founding fathers. Okay. I maybe heard an amen from the Canadians. I'm not sure at this point. John MacArthur is not the only one to assert this viewpoint. It has become popular amongst many Christian historians to argue that America was in fact built upon and born out of an unholy rebellion, and that the Declaration is something more to be ashamed of than a document to be celebrated. Mark Noll is the most prominent among these, but also George Marsden, Nathan Hatch, Greg Fraser, a number of others. For them, as Christians, the American Revolution is something we should be embarrassed by, for it wasn't really Christian at all. It was really the opposite of Christian. It was built on an ungodly act of resistance and rebellion. Noll, Marsden, and Hatch made this assertion in their 1983 work, The Search for Christian America, which was written in response to a 1981 work by Francis Schaeffer entitled The Christian Manifesto, where Schaeffer had argued in an attempt to call Christians in America to become politically active, he had argued that we need to return America back to its Christian roots. Noll, Marsden, and Hatch said, well, America doesn't have unambiguously Christian roots. In fact, it's rooted in an unchristian rebellion against lawful authority. Mark Noll, in particular, was down on the Declaration of Independence and said there really was no threat of British tyranny encroaching on the colonists' rights. According to him, quote, the series of charges against George III in the Declaration of Independence constituted propaganda of the most irresponsible kind, in a personal letter to Schaeffer written in 1982. So, problem number one, should we as Christians indeed be embarrassed by the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence? Problem number two, should we as conservatives be embarrassed by the Declaration of Independence? Isn't the Declaration fundamentally a declaration of radical new sentiments, sentiments that make it revolutionary and a radical document? Historian Joseph Ellis has said that the Declaration is a radical document that locates sovereignty in the individual and depicts government as an alien force, making rebellion against it a natural act. It's not conservative at all. It's a radical document that justifies rebellion. Or Gordon Wood, another historian. The Revolution was the most radical and far-reaching event in American history. This is what many progressives claim. They love the Declaration of Independence because it's not conservative. For them, it's a manifesto of individual rights and individual autonomy, and its assertion that all are created equal and therefore all have the right to autonomously engage in their own pursuit of happiness, taking that wherever they may desire. Progressives tend to focus on those statements in the preamble of the Declaration and focus exclusively on the assertions of equality and the pursuit of happiness, and want to use those assertions to promote a progressive social agenda. Does that make sense? So progressives often would highlight those things and see it not as a conservative document. They view the Declaration as a social and political manifesto whereby radical new notions of equality are to be pursued and the old order of things is to be cast aside. So I'm going to address these two questions. But first, let's take a step back and look at the main outlines and argument of this document, the Declaration. What was the Declaration of Independence? I would argue this morning, fundamentally, the Declaration of Independence was a declaration to the world that it was no longer, that the colonies were no longer acknowledging the jurisdiction of the British government. It seems simple, right? It was fundamentally a declaration to the world that the colonies were no longer acknowledging the political authority of the British government over them, since that government had sought to govern them in contradiction to the rule of law and against the fundamental rights and privileges it had promised to them. So when you look at the opening of the Declaration, this is essentially what it states, that we are dissolving the political bands which have connected us to Britain, and we are now stating forth the reasons why. To give justification for these actions, we are going to declare to the world that we are indeed independent, and these are the reasons why we are pursuing it. So at the end of the Declaration, like bookends on the whole document, that is indeed what they do. They declare that the colonies are and of a right ought to be free and independent states. So bookending this document is the purpose of the document. And we need to keep in mind this simple point. This is the function and purpose of the document, to make an argument and to state our case before the other nations of the world why we were no longer acknowledging the jurisdiction of the British government. That's the main point. That's the main purpose. The Declaration was not intended as a political manifesto or as a program for revolutionary social change. It was not a philosophical tract on natural rights. It was rather a declaration to the world the reasons why the colonies were now compelled to dissolve their political allegiance and submission to the state of Great Britain. It's a simple point, but an important one. In justifying this declaration, the Declaration of Independence made an argument. It began, and these are my summary words, it began by saying God has given to men certain natural rights. Governments are instituted by men to preserve and secure these natural rights. Whenever a government becomes despotic, oppressive, and destructive to men's natural rights, it's the people's right and duty to overthrow it and establish another. And in fact, indeed, the British government has become despotic, oppressive, lawless, and destructive. Those are my words. I'm summarizing the argument. So this is the argument laid forth. And then just taking a snippet in italics, these are direct quotes from the document. Here are some of the examples of the British government's oppressions. For cutting off our trade with all parts of the world. One remembers the Boston Port Act, which shut down the port of Boston to all shipping and commerce, taking away the livelihood of those engaged in the shipping business, subjugating Massachusetts to starvation. In December 23rd of 1775, the king shut down all the shipping to all the colonies, in fact, starving many living in the shipping centers of the day. For imposing taxes on us without our consent, the 1765 Stamp Act broke a precedent whereby the British Parliament established a direct tax on internal goods without the consent of the taxpayers. The power to tax is the power to destroy. If it doesn't have limits on it, it's virtually an unlimited power. For depriving us in many cases of the benefits of a trial by jury, it became more and more common for the Vice Admiralty courts to take over colonial cases. For transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses. Rather than a trial by a jury, colonials could be put on ships and taken across the ocean to stand trial. Of course, where there'd be no witnesses, facing a hostile jury and incurring great expense and suffering for them and their families, just merely on being charged. For taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our government. The foundation for colonial law, even the foundation for private property, suspended in the colonies. For suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. In 1766, the Parliament had declared that they have authority over the colonies to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever, which was the same exact language applied to the conquered people of Ireland by the British Parliament in 1719. So, absolutism coming to the colonies. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. Before the Declaration, there had been 3 towns, at least 3 that I know of, that were fired upon and burnt to the ground by British warships that fired incendiary devices into Charleston, Massachusetts, Falmouth, Maine, and Norfolk, Virginia. This is not propaganda. There were 3 towns that lay in ashes. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. The Declaration is not the only statement. Countless petitions have been made to the King, to the Parliament, to the British people, but they fell on deaf ears. Therefore, we declare that these united colonies are and of a right ought to be free and independent states. This is the argument. This is the argument. The government was intended to protect us, protect our natural rights. The British have failed. They have failed, and we are now compelled to absolve our allegiance to them. So is such a document conservative? I would say yes, resoundingly so. The Declaration is not revolutionary in the sense that it didn't really call for anything new. It essentially protested something new. It protested the usurpation of long-held British rights and liberties guaranteed in the British Constitution, the Magna Carta, the colonial charters, and long-standing precedents and traditions. The real revolutionaries in this instance were those in the British government, King George III, Lord Grenville, North, and Townsend. If you're looking for revolutionaries of the period, it is in the British government, changing long-established traditions, abrogating many rights and liberties. The American colonists were intent on preserving or conserving the valuable principles, protections, safeguards of their way of life they had inherited from the British and enjoyed until the mid-1760s. So this makes our so-called revolution very, very different than the French Revolution. The French Revolution was indeed a revolution in the modern sense of the word, a philosophical and ideological revolution intended to remake the social, political, and religious orientation of society, orienting all of society around an ideological commitment to equality, liberty, and fraternity. But this was not our revolution. This is not our heritage. Our revolution is fundamentally a conservative attempt to preserve long-standing British principles of limited government, rule of law, representative government, government by consent, no taxation without representation, the right to a jury trial, etc. I'm not the only one to argue this. Russell Kirk, already quoted, stated the Patriots intended no radical break with the past and thought of themselves as conservators rather than as innovators. Daniel Boorstin, the most obvious peculiarity of our American Revolution is that it was hardly a revolution at all. Trevor Colburn, American revolutionaries argued that their stand was essentially conservative. It was the corrupted mother country which was pursuing a radical course of action, pressing innovations and encroachments upon her long-suffering colonies. Russell Kirk refers to the American Revolution as a revolution not made, but prevented. So I think it's safe to say the progressives misunderstand the conservative nature of the Declaration of Independence. They fundamentally misunderstand it when they illegitimately try to use it to promote utopian visions of human autonomy and radical notions of social equality. The Declaration is fundamentally a conservative document seeking to preserve the principles of society and governance that were inherited from the British. It stands in great continuity with a Western heritage and tradition that's worth conserving. But I still haven't answered the first question, have I? Was the Declaration Christian? You should know that it was the general opinion of many Protestant theologians, starting in the early 16th century, that the general duty to submit to your government, laid out in Romans 13 and elsewhere, is not an absolute duty. They argued that the arguments given for the general obligation in verses 1 and 2 are qualified by the kind of ruler that is in view in the rationale given in verses 3 and 4. So you see the general duty that we all have as Christians in verses 1 and 2, as the rationale is given in verses 3 and 4, a particular kind of ruler is mentioned. This is a ruler that is not a terror to good conduct, but to bad, a ruler that is God's servant for your good. If a ruler begins oppressing and abusing those governed, then the rationale for the general duty disappears. Such were to be regarded as illegitimate usurpers of legitimate political authority. If a political authority showed himself to be clearly, quote, not God's servant for your good, then the duty to submit does not apply as the rationale disappears. It was a long-standing view that resistance to oppressive absolutist governments were not only a permissible option, but sometimes actually a moral duty, a Christian duty. This is the position argued for by a large number of Protestant theologians, starting in the 1500s, extending in the 16 and 1700s as well. Just a partial list I've given to you here. So this is the Christian view. The Protestant view, it's one view anyway, not the only view, but there was a long-standing Protestant argument that resisting political authorities is sometimes justified. What is further, the colonial clergy had argued for and acted upon this view of justified resistance when they, in the late 1600s, overthrew an oppressive Stuart governor in New England, Governor Edmund Andros. One clergyman wrote and anonymously published this pamphlet justifying the moral right of political resistance in the act of overthrowing a British authority in the late 1600s. You'll notice it talks about the revolution of New England vindicated, and you'll note the date. I hope you can see it up there. The date is 1691 in Boston. This is written by a clergyman justifying the morality of political resistance in Boston, doing so not in the 1700s, but in the 1600s. There's a long-standing Protestant tradition, when one looks from the perspective of theological history, that the American revolutionaries were doing nothing that was out of step with their own Protestant theological and ethical tradition. No radical shift, no radical innovations. In conclusion, America's Declaration of Independence accords very nicely with our Christian and conservative commitments because it asserts that the state is not absolute. We are not morally obligated to treat our political authorities as if they were absolute. And it is at times justifiable to resist political authorities that assume an oppressive and absolutist posture toward us. So is the Declaration of Independence Christian and conservative? I would say yes. And the American founding is indeed firmly in line with Christian and conservative principles. We need not be ashamed as Christians and conservatives of our founding, but rather we ought to celebrate it and perpetuate its principles. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Stewart, for that wonderful introduction to the Declaration. And now it's my privilege to be able to talk with you about the U.S. Constitution. And I appreciate so much my fellow colleagues' introductions to that, because we have to understand our U.S. Constitution in context. Often with all of the political smorgasbord of options that Dr. Copeland talked about, we think that we today in 2018 can simply pick and choose what we want to believe, what political narrative is most expedient, and we think that there may not be one particularly theologically correct position over another. And we tend to ignore all of the great history that Dr. Stewart talked to us about. And we tend, and our students also tend, to look at the Declaration as passé history. We even tend to look at the Constitution as this document that was forged by the founders and being ruled now by the dead hand of these men in 1787, and why should that have any influence on us today? So what I want to bridge is the gap between the Declaration as our founding legal document and explain why conservatism is truly the only Christian position when we look at interpretation of the U.S. Constitution. So we have to first start with the question. Ultimately, is the United States, based on this history, a divine or natural law society, or are we built upon the social contract theory? Most of the progressives, libertarians, and even Christians, and even sometimes conservatives, will approach the U.S. Constitution with the underlying worldview presumption that we are founded as a nation on this type of social contract. The idea being that we as men who are free and have free will can all come together and decide for ourselves what is legitimate authority, what laws we should enact. And it ultimately comes down to a simple majority rule. That's why you'll hear a lot of the Democrats and progressives refer to us as a democracy, because democracy rules, mob mentality rules, whoever is currently in power will simply prevail. But natural law, and the term that I prefer to use is divine law, because we specifically recognize God's sole legitimate authority. And that's ultimately what our founders recognized in the Declaration's legitimacy. So when we talk about the founding legal documents, we can't separate the US Constitution from the Declaration's mandate, because ultimately then we're left with just our smorgasbord of options. And we're left to say, well, what is best just for me? What is best in terms of my political viewpoint? And we separate that completely from our Christian theology. One of the things that I so appreciate about Colorado Christian University is that we understand that this isn't simply a Christian veneer over what we teach. We have to approach every subject matter, including law, including political science, including economics, including business, everything that we do, from a fundamental worldview premise built on the sole legitimate authority of God. That's what our founders recognized. So the Declaration of Independence ultimately provides our authority in divine law and legitimacy to create a new sovereignty. As Dr. Stewart pointed out, this wasn't just a rebellion. This was acknowledging, for one of the first times in human history, that God himself is our only moral authority. And from that foundation of truth, government then exists. And the moral imperative of government to preserve and protect our liberty and freedom is derived from that fundamental worldview. So then, as Dr. Copeland recognized, the Federalist Papers they provided the founding rationale for our new government. Once we had the Declaration, we had this mandate to create a new society built upon the recognition that God alone is our authority. How do we establish a new government? What does that look like? Arguably, the founders could have done a lot of different things. We could have had multiple branches of government. We could have had a king. We could have done things in a lot of different ways. But the Federalist Papers acknowledged that a constitutional republic with a separation of powers, with specific limited authority granted to our federal government and reserving non-enumerated powers, which is the legal speak for specific powers given to our federal government, then were reserved to the states, because state and local government should ultimately understand what is best for the constituency in that area. They also recognize that the amendment process will help just continue to refine our government as we continue through American history. So that provided the rationale. And then finally, with this context, we have ultimately the US Constitution, which is simply the supreme law. It's the set of specific limited powers that are given to our government to operate. And these are the supreme laws that are delegated to our government, but importantly, are founded under the authority and lawful morality, ultimately, of the Christian worldview. And that is why it's so important to understand and recognize our spiritual heritage. So this is a chart that I have created to show you ultimately the differences, and we'll go through this quickly, between a society that's premised on God as our sole moral authority versus the social contract theory. We like to talk a lot about just interpretation of law. What is our Supreme Court going to do next? We had a great conversation this past fall with the folks from Alliance Defending Freedom talking about the Masterpiece Cake case. We're seeing a lot of these sorts of cases come before the US Supreme Court. And when we talk about interpreting our laws, when we look at the debate that's going to be happening in the next couple of weeks with immigration, what should we do as a country? Well, if it's just up to the moral majority vote, then how can we best preserve and protect freedom ultimately? Because majority just wins. And so rather than starting at the bottom of this chart, we have to understand that our interpretation of law must be grounded in our origin and our understanding of our worldview. If we start with man, which both the progressives on the left and the libertarians on the right, they start with man. And ultimately, is government, this conglomeration and association of man, are they the best moral arbiters for us? Or, as libertarians suggest, can man determine his own morality and government should totally stay out? Both of these ideas and paradigms fail because they fail to recognize that God is our sole authority. And so freedom and liberty doesn't mean that we can either do only what the government permits and licenses, And so now that we've, quote unquote, legalized same-sex marriage, now it must be morally permissible because the government says it. Or on the flip side, that government should totally stay out. And whatever I want to do and be subject to my whim, ultimately, I'm the master of my own destiny, and I can decide what's morally correct and permissible for myself. So we have to start at the foundation. And so once you see that the origin must be God, then the rationale for our moral law and what ultimately government can do, according to Romans 13, and being that valid, rightful, appropriate authority, is fixed, it's objective. God and truth does not change. And we know that from Scripture, where the social contract theory says that it's fluid, subjective. Morality today looks very different than morality did 100 years ago, and that's fine, according to the progressives and the libertarians. And I don't mean to just single out those two groups, but people on the far left and people on the far right of ultimately the balance that government fundamentally is for our good. It does have legitimate authority from God himself, but only to a very limited extent. So then when we get down to the interpretation of the law, through the mandate of the Declaration of Independence, our society was founded on understanding that the only proper role of government is to preserve and protect our unalienable rights that God himself ordained and established and gave to every single human being made in the image of God. So any interpretation of law, any legitimate government must be consistent with God's biblical truth. The social contract theory, on the other hand, changes to the whim of a dominant society. So today we have same-sex marriage, yesterday we didn't, and that's okay because we're enlightened, we're, woke, as our students say, right? And that ultimately fails the fundamental truth and the absolute nature and unchanging character of God. So this is probably the most important slide that I'm going to show you today. This is what I call the founding document hierarchy. Now, what the progressives and people who pick from that smorgasbord of political viewpoints will suggest is that the U.S. Constitution, which you can see is at the top of this pyramid, is actually separate and apart from the history of the Declaration, from our roots in that objective truth. And so they will frame the Constitution as simply being that social contract. We can ignore it, we can interpret it fluidly, whatever our will happens to be in the subjective sense. But we can't allow our U.S. Constitution to be understood or interpreted apart from its roots ultimately in God's moral truth. The only authority that the Constitution has ultimately is in divine law and in God's nature and his ultimate authority. The legitimacy for the Declaration, as Dr. Stewart pointed out, is found in the Declaration and is found in those founders who understood that all authority begins with God. And any government system that goes against that ultimately has illegitimate authority. So then we have the rationale in the Federalist Papers, other founding documents, and then ultimately we get to our supreme law that was built upon this hierarchy of truth. So I've been talking about legitimacy in the law, and ultimately I want to define that word for you and in a legal sense. Law can't be separated from morality. We understand that intuitively because we all understand there is a criminal code in society. Everything that we codify is our society's statement and expression of our morality. And when we say it is wrong to murder, there are impositions of government and consequences for that conduct, that breach of moral duty. We are claiming a moral imperative. So it's not that our society can or may legislate morality. It's that we already do, and every society already has. It's just, is it illegitimate, or is it ultimately legitimate morality? So this means, and this term, is lawfulness and inherent authority by virtue of being authorized or in accordance with truth. And remember, truth does not change. Conforming with a valid, rightful, and appropriate authority. So remember, there's a drastic distinction between the term lawful and the term legal. Legal means simply in accordance with civil law. Right now, abortion is legal, but we know that it is certainly not lawful. Lawful is in accordance with objective, fundamental morality, with truth. So for a law to be legitimate, it must conform to truth and ultimately to God himself as our divine lawgiver. So the founding of America was premised and built upon divine law. Legitimate authority for a new government was recognizing rights that transcend king or man. We don't have the unalienable right to freedom of speech simply because we have the First Amendment. I tell my students in constitutional law class to say I have a First Amendment right to freedom of speech is actually an incorrect statement. I have a fundamental unalienable right given to me by God himself because I'm a human being made in his image, that the government is simply mandated to preserve and protect. Do you see that difference? And that foundation is so important as we recognize what a great society we live in, because our founders recognized that truth and they established our Constitution on that founding. The social contract theory and any other viewpoint besides conserving, that's the root word of conservatism, conserving these fundamental truths, would have to start with the premise that it's an illegitimate rebellion and that our rights are simply license from our government that can be changed at whim. That is not the truth of our Constitution. That is not ultimately the truth of God. So our Declaration of Independence, our legitimacy and authority to become a sovereign nation, understood a few key principles. First, that our rights are unalienable and come from God. Our rights pre-exist the U.S. Constitution. Our Declaration was written 11 years before our Constitution was ratified. They couldn't possibly be talking about so-called constitutional rights. We weren't governed by the U.S. Constitution then. The founders recognized that our rights are ours because we are human. That the only purpose of government is to protect and preserve our God-given rights. And when government usurps those God-given rights, as Dr. Stewart pointed out, it is not only the right, but also the duty and obligation of the Christian conservative and of God's people to alter or abolish that government. Our founders were so wise by giving us an amendment process, by giving us a republic of a trustee government that we can change the nature and composition of our government. We have elections for that purpose. We have Article 5 as an amendment process for that purpose, so that we don't have to go through another rebellion or so-called rebellion. We can change the character and nature of our government to best continue to preserve and protect our unalienable rights through this design that our U.S. Constitution provides. The Declaration also legitimized the independence of the United States to separate from England, as Dr. Stewart pointed out, asserting divine rights, including legal rights, the right and duty of separation and revolution. So any government system, including ours, is only legitimate and has authority when it operates to protect our God-given rights in accordance with divine law. So Dr. Stewart put up this quotation, and I want to highlight a few things about the Declaration. The founders recognized the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle us to our rights. It is not the U.S. Constitution that provides our rights. And that is so important to recognize, that our founders established that in what I like to call as an attorney, the great complaint in society, the first founding legal document. And the Declaration also provides this very important worldview statement. This is the mandate for our U.S. Constitution that it must be consistent with. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Truth is discoverable. As C.S. Lewis writes in Mere Christianity, as so many Christian authors have written about the nature of discoverable truth. Truth is discovered. We as man didn't create it. We simply acknowledge that it exists. I may not know or even care about gravity, but it exists. It's in the reality to which we're presented, and ultimately it controls, because God imposed his law on our world. Truth is discovered by man, not created by man. Our founders recognized that. We hold these truths to be self-evident. That's a legal term for, I don't have to even give any more proof than that. It just is. That all men, what are the truths they're talking about? All men are created equal. They're endowed by their creator, not their social contract, not other men, not by themselves, but by our creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is the worldview statement our founders provided for us. And so I want to talk a little bit also about the distinction of unalienable rights and legal rights as we recognize them in our discussion of the U.S. Constitution. Divine rights and legal rights are very, very different. Legal rights are those bestowed upon a person by a given society or government. Those are actually privileges. We have to merit them, we have to qualify for them. In a sense, we have to apply for them. In order to vote, for example, I have to show I'm a resident of the county, I'm of age, I'm a US citizen, etc. That's a legal right. The government can rescind that or change it at whim. But divine rights, unalienable rights, means my right cannot be alienated from me, but it is given by God himself. It is universal. So then, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from consent of the governed. Now, consent of the governed is often proof texted or lifted out of the Declaration to say, well, that means social contract. No. We can't just look at we the people or consent of the governed, meaning whatever it is that we as collective man want to do. That's not what the Declaration is talking about. We have to secure, ultimately, the fundamental freedoms and liberty that God himself provides. Skip over that. And Dr. Stewart already talked about the end of this, but I want to highlight that these 5 lawyers, by the way, they were all 5 lawyers on the Declaration Committee, they understood whose courtroom they were in. And they said, we, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America and General Congress assembled, appealing to whom? The supreme judge of the universe, of the world, for the rectitude of our intentions. They knew that the ultimate authority is God himself. Rectitude is another legal word meaning morally correct behavior or thinking, righteousness, lawfulness. And for support of this declaration with firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, God's sovereignty, we mutually pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. We are a Christian nation, period. So this was a direct appeal to divine law. And ultimately, as we look at this pyramid, it's so important to recognize the U.S. Constitution in context. And I'm going to skip through, I added a few slides about the Federalist Papers. And you can, if you want to see the rest of this presentation, actually have it on YouTube, and it's a lot more thorough. Just Google my name, constitutional literacy, you'll find it. But ultimately, this is talking about the Bill of Rights and why our Bill of Rights is not granting our rights, but rather understanding that there are rights that must be preserved and protected. But for sake of time, I will go through this and get right to the U.S. Constitution. So what is the Constitution? Now that we understand this in context, and we understand that we can't simply read it fluidly, we can't interpret it any way that we want, we can't just pick from this smorgasbord of political options. A lot of people will say, well, the mention of God is nowhere in the U.S. Constitution. So God didn't ordain or establish a Christian nation. We can do whatever we want. Well, it is only the supreme civil law of the United States. It is only the law, only the nuts and bolts. Framed by 55 delegates to the Constitutional Convention, it's a legal document. 32 of the signers were lawyers. They understood how to draft a legal document. The sole purpose, as we've been discussing, is under the legitimacy of that declaration's mandate. So the Constitution provides these few articles and its specific limited powers to the federal government to operate. That's all that it is. If any of you have read legislation, you'll see that there is the intent of the bill drafters. There's kind of a preamble, if you will, to the actual law. The actual law doesn't provide all of the rationale, the legislative history, the intent of the legislators. It just provides this simple law that, you know, if I go out here on Alameda and go 75 miles an hour, then a police officer could pull me over. That's part of the law, right? But it doesn't explain the public welfare doctrine that's behind it. It doesn't explain all of these things. We can't separate the Declaration and its intent from the Constitution simply because it's only the nuts and bolts. So then constitutional law, which is my favorite subject. What is constitutional law then? Well, that's forming the body of law that interprets and forms judicial case law and precedent from the written text of the Constitution. I like to say there are really two constitutions in play right now. One is our actual text, and then there's a second constitution, which is what the Supreme Court has given us. Some of it very good, some of it incredibly bad, and some things kind of in the middle. But constitutional law has to find its place under the U.S. Constitution. Article 3 that gives judges their judicial authority to interpret and review the U.S. Constitution does not provide for going above and recreating the Constitution. So we have to remember again that legitimacy comes from the Declaration. Authority comes from God and his law, not from judges. That becomes incredibly important. So the text of the Constitution, getting all the way back to the bottom of that chart, the text of the Constitution and civil law cannot be interpreted in a vacuum. It can't be interpreted apart from the Declaration and the foundation in the Christian worldview, which ultimately is recognizing truth. So there are two theories of constitutional interpretation, quickly. One that you've heard of is judicial activism, and the second is judicial restraint. We have to make sure that we understand that we restrain our government. We put it in its proper place. What the secular progressives and ultimately the libertarians would like to do is draw a line under the Constitution and put this on a judicial activist hierarchy. They would like to say that there's no legitimate authority. We're a social contract theory state. So ultimately, our Constitution is simply civil law. It's divorced from morality. It doesn't mean anything. So then when we have the Supreme Court, which is derived from our Constitution, then the interpretation is based on a secular humanist social contract theory foundation. We have to remember the legitimate hierarchy. And ultimately, interpreting the US Constitution, we have to remember the preamble, that we the people means God's people, the same people who have unalienable rights given by God. That in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, do all of the things that government legitimately is authorized to do, secure the blessing of liberty, to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. And by the way, that word posterity is the best evidence that we have for pro-life, because our posterity and our founders recognized that the unborn, the future generations, also have protection under our civil law. That word posterity means me and you, that our founders, even all the way back in 1787, recognized. So when you think about this in terms of why this is so important to answer the critical questions facing our country today, it is not at all just passé history. What Dr. Stewart talked about is so incredibly important. And when we look at our options for politics, for policy, all of those things that Dr. Copeland was talking about, we have to read and understand our U.S. Constitution in light of truth. That we, the people, is recognizing we are God's people and submitting to his ultimate authority. Thank you very much. And I will go ahead and invite my colleagues back up, and we will take your questions and answers for as long as Dr. Parkos allows. So, questions. Dr. Watson.
I appreciate everything I've heard this morning, but I have one hesitation. Paul Johnson, in his book, History of the American People, which is the text we use in all of our American history courses, he said that had the revolution taken place a generation or two earlier, it would have been far more Christian because it was influenced by the First Great Awakening. Had it taken place a generation or two later, it also would have been far more Christian and evangelical because it would have been influenced by the Second Great Awakening. However, our revolution took place in between, in a period where the Enlightenment was at its strongest. The Enlightenment, secular Enlightenment, he strengthens that by saying that most of our more important founders, Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, were either deists and or Masons, which is really founded on the bedrock of deism. Anyway, and of course, I guess I'd like to ask the three of you, would you agree with Paul Johnson on this? And would we hesitate to say that our founding documents are as Christian without being Enlightenment, or were they more Enlightenment and not as Christian as was presented this morning?
I'm happy to take the first stab at that and then give Dr. Stewart also the opportunity. So I would say we're living in an even worse era right now than the Enlightenment. And truth doesn't change. And so regardless of whether or not the founders were as sincere of Orthodox Christians as we would hope, regardless of whether I am the best sincere Orthodox Christian that I can be, truth doesn't change. And our founders recognized God's moral authority, and they put that in our founding legal documents. And our Constitution was not perfect. We've had 27 amendments throughout the course of its history, and we can continue to amend that document. Our founders recognized that it was not their particular perspective, it wasn't their truth that they ultimately were subject to or that they ultimately were placing within our founding documents, but recognizing God's truth. And regardless of what influences they had, regardless of all of the collateral evidence, and there is a lot of evidence that not all of our founders were the sincere Orthodox Christians, that's not the best argument. Our best argument ultimately is truth, and that our founding documents were premised and founded upon that truth that doesn't change.
I don't know if I have much to add. Certainly history is always very messy. We shouldn't superimpose particular Enlightenment beliefs held by particular individuals over the whole colonial experience or all of colonial America. I think when Jefferson's letters were finally published, in the early 1800s, many clergymen who considered themselves Jeffersonian were repulsed to find some of his views. So I don't know if it's very difficult to bore down into the rank and file of what colonial Americans were believing at that period. I think sometimes we privilege people like Jefferson. Jefferson's more of an anomaly in my mind for his connections to the French and French Enlightenment thought. So I don't know. John Witherspoon certainly wasn't in that category, signer of the Declaration. So I'm not sure. It's just very difficult to overgeneralize, privileging one or two of the founders and their views over against the bulk of the clergy and the bulk of the colonial mind. So I'm not sure what else to say.
Referring back to Paul Johnson, and I'm not totally sure when we think about Paul Johnson and what he gave us in his literature, enlightenment was certainly one of the points, but I think the Great Awakening from Paul Johnson's standpoint would be unification, and that these documents wouldn't be possible without the Great Awakening and the unification that it brought our country during that time. So I guess my question, and I agree with everything we're talking about this morning, preface that, I agree with everything. But my question would be, because of the Great Awakening and what that contributed to our society and to the writing of the Constitution, to the writing of the Declaration of Independence, would we be able to secure such documents today?
I hope so, God willing. That's the great problem of human nature, right? Is that liberty and freedom are so tenuous. And we have to make sure that we continue as the posterity of our founders to protect and preserve the great legacy and entrustment that they've given us. And one of the reasons that I am such an advocate for the Constitution and religious freedom is for that exact reason. Because if we fail to recognize this, and we fail to teach our students here to preserve and protect this, and we let them separate our theology from our political science viewpoints, then we failed to pass that on to the next generation. And I don't know if it would be possible today. I hope that it would, but that's why I'm very grateful to be an American and to live in this great country. And again, this is why we have not just an argument for biblical truth and a Christian nation, but the only argument. If secular progressives don't want to assent to our US Constitution and our founding morality, they would have to overhaul this and they would have to change it, and that would be an illegitimate rebellion. So it's up to us to protect and preserve this, and God willing, we'll do that.
Good morning, thank you. Again, I agree with everything that was said today, and thank you for sharing that, that's awesome. My name is Roger Chandler with the College of Adult and Graduate Studies, and I have a practical question for you. With the legitimacy talk, and which I agree with, how do we engage and continue the conversation for those that go, there is no God, there is no legitimacy, there is no higher authority? How do we practically continue that conversation without turning it ugly, so to speak?
That's also a great question, and I appreciate that. And this is where our Christian worldview also calls us to build relationships and to speak truth to our students, to our community, and speak truth to power in the culture. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. And I think our faculty is very particularly adept at talking to our students and building those relationships. And I would also highly recommend Greg Koukl's book, Tactics, which talks about, apologetics from just a general viewpoint can be very abrasive. I, particularly being an attorney, have had to learn that that sometimes I can be very abrasive in my zealousness for truth and have to learn how to, as John Stonestreet told us last time, speak winsomely. And to recognize that people will come from a lot of different viewpoints, and often their worldview is influenced by the hurt that they've gone through, by losses they've gone through, by their own life experiences, and to bring them ultimately to the point that they can see the tension point between their worldview and truth. That's where we're the most effective. And whether that'll be for 3 minutes in a media interview, or whether that will be over the course of a 10-year relationship with someone that you're just continuing to invest, I think it's the responsibility of each of us as Christian conservatives to be that advocate in our sphere of influence. And there's no one way to answer that question. And I always look at also the example of Jeremiah, the prophet in the Old Testament. He didn't win one convert in his entire ministry, but yet God didn't call him a failure because he was faithful. So we just need to be faithful.
Hi, Ron Stites. Thanks for those great talks. One of the first places that the legitimacy of the founding documents are attacked is on the issue of slavery. They're pretty silent on that, or ambivalent. How do you respond to that sort of initial attack on the legitimacy of our founding documents?
Okay. All right, they're nominating me again. Okay. So that's a great question, and one that I think goes back to actually this gentleman's question about would it be possible to have this type of a document in today's culture. The founders were also somewhat pragmatic as lawyers and recognized that there were certain concessions in the immediacy of the necessity for ratification of the Constitution that they made some concessions. But that's why they didn't set up their own view as truth. They simply said, this is our initial best effort, and it was a great one. But we have since then had, we have Amendment 13, 14, all of those things that now have outlawed slavery. Women can vote. I'm super excited about that. I think that was a great amendment. So we have a lot of things that have clarified and better preserved our freedoms through the Constitution, through later amendments. And the amendment process is such a wonderful, wonderful thing. And so when people try to say, well, the founders weren't these sincere Orthodox Christians, or, oh, they allowed slavery, all that's true and all of that was wrong. And we can recognize that, acknowledge it, and say, yet, we as a Christian nation have recognized that and we have counteracted it through later altering our government, which was exactly what the founders intended.
I would add, I think that, that American church history actually tells us a little bit, too, about that. There were Christians in the country, there were particularly from the Covenanter church, the Reformed Presbyterians, the Covenanter Scots would come across, who dissented from the Constitution. They wouldn't take the oath of office, wouldn't serve in the military because the Constitution permitted slavery. And they continued to dissent from all participation in government up till the time of the Civil War. There was still some debate within that church over whether it was legitimate to take up arms. And when some of their ministers took up arms for the North, they finally decided to change that. But so there are examples, though, of Christians who, and they were sort of scattered throughout the colonies, although particularly in the North. And I think their dissent from, particularly on the slavery issue, contributed then to the power of the anti-slavery movement in the North.
Excuse me, I have a question. And I want to thank all three of you. I think you've done a marvelous job, and it's an important topic, I think, to educate all of us with. But we've talked about the progressive movement. And the progressive movement, as we know, I think many of us know, has been around for a long time. They're very patient. They have an agenda. They have a cause. Can you talk a little bit about the progressive movement and give us more information there, please?
Well, I'm nominated. Well, progressivism has come in waves. Views that folks like John F. Kennedy had in the 60s, the war on poverty with Lyndon Johnson, were progressive movements sort of within the Democratic Party. But progressivism had there was a right-wing version, had Teddy Roosevelt and tackling the monopolies and the creation of national parks and so on. So we have a history of that, and I think this is just the latest wave of progressivism. I'm not sure if we could say what the starting point was here in the last 20 years, but certainly the last 12 years, the last 8 years anyway, have been a significant uptick in progressivism. And they managed to win, and Jenna knows this better than I do in working with people in the media and so on, but the progressives have managed to win the storytelling. They're able to persuade folks that the latest tax reform, for example, primarily benefits the wealthy. Well, that's not really a factual understanding of what the new tax reform bill does, but they consistently win the narrative, and it has to do with obviously their intimate connection with the media. But and maybe you want to comment on that. But I think that's a big part of what's happened is they've taken over the narrative, and we've not been very effective at telling the rest of the story, and the conservative story. And I think one of the challenges that Christian conservatives face right now, and I think Jeff Hunt as Centennial is finding this, is that how are Christian conservatives supposed to respond to a populist president? Is he conservative? How does his lifestyle comport with his faith and so on? And it makes it's a challenging moment, I think, for Christian conservatives to have a clean, clear voice. Actually, so I'm glad Jenna's on TV and I'm not usually doing that. I don't know if you want to comment further.
Sure, thanks. That's a great question, Rick. And one of the things that I think has been undermining conservatism throughout just the last, even 10 or 20 years, and especially in recent history, is that we tend to view conservatism just as a political viewpoint, and we talk about the so-called conservative agenda. Well, we don't, as Christians, have any other agenda than promoting the gospel and ultimately worshiping God with all that we are. And so our conservatism is not derived from our public policy or any of those things that are agenda-driven, that we meet the progressives or the libertarians on their social contract theory playing field. We have to make sure that we are conserving, and because of that, ultimately recognizing truth. And so one of the problems that we've had, as Dr. Copeland pointed out, is that we're not shaping our narrative correctly. We are not actually advocating for principles of truth. We are only advocating politics. And politics isn't about truth. It's ultimately just about majority control. It's about party. That's not what Christians are ultimately obliged to. I'm not a conservative. I'm not a Republican because that's my choice. I'm not even a Christian just because that's my choice of religion. I ultimately am recognizing truth. And because of that, then outflows my worldview. And so what happened in the 1960s, and there's a 1965 case called Griswold versus Connecticut, and what the secular progressives were very, very good at doing was commandeering the courts through the sexual revolution. And that started with Griswold versus Connecticut, which was one of the first Planned Parenthood cases on contraceptives. And what happened in that case is that the justices looked and said, we don't actually have any textual authority to review any sort of state legislation on this. So what do we do? Well, instead of saying, sorry, we can't accept this case, they decided to come up with what's called the penumbra doctrine. What that ultimately is it's some scientific term that the rocket scientists can explain far better than me. But what that meant was we are going to read literally between the lines of the text of the Constitution and find so-called rights that emanate from the vast penumbra. And through that, we're going to recognize our jurisdiction, our authority to create these judicial decisions. And starting in 1965, because the progressives wanted licensed, government-sanctioned, ultimately sexual freedom, then we're now at the point that we are today. And that case was the foundation of everything that we have seen since 1965. That basis is what has given us decisions in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, Roe versus Wade, Obergefell versus Hodges, all of these things that have transpired. So what we have to do as advocates, and why I'm so glad we have a legal studies program, by the way, here, shout out to them, is that we're training future advocates to understand the law and to ultimately meet it with truth. That's why the Masterpiece Cake case is so important. That's why it's so important to advocate in the realm of religious freedom and of keeping a limited government conserving truth. So we have to make sure that we understand conservatism. We shape our narrative according to truth, not to agenda.
Hello? Yeah. So along with what you're saying and some of the other questions, we recognize this fundamental truth, and we are very comfortable with that. Again, how do we answer people, the very fact that we have amendments to the Constitution? How is that not a form of social construct then, because at the time they thought it was right. Now through time we realize that wasn't right. How do we know now that we're doing what's right? Maybe there's some things down the road that will need to be, that's another argument about social construct. So how do we answer that?
So we have to first define right and good. And the founders gave that to us in the Declaration. They said that truth is self-evident. And so is our government ever going to perfectly preserve and protect good and right in society? No, we're going to make mistakes. But that's why our founders gave us the amendment process. They said in that whole sphere of government and in understanding what we are vested with doing, we can correct our mistakes. And so the amendment process isn't just about finding a simple majority or going through the whole Article 5 process. They made it difficult on purpose. But what the founders did is say, we know that truth is, it's discoverable, God ordained it, and remember, that's objective. God doesn't change. He is the definition of right and good in society. And so from that premise, all of our amendments, all of our interpretation, all of that has to be grounded in that. What the progressives will do with the amendment process is say, well, you can't be an originalist, you can't be a textualist because it's fluid, it can change. Well, no, it's not fluid in the sense that I can read the very same words that you do, that the Supreme Court does, and that we can have and interpret different meanings. That's not what that means. It means that we can go into the Constitution and we can amendment to further God's truth. And so when people say, well, how do we know what's right or good in society? Ask them, what do you mean by right? How do you know what right is? Is that your opinion? Is it mine? Is it the 9 justices we have? Is it Congress? Is it President Trump? Well, our founders didn't establish any of man's whim to fulfill that definition. Only God himself and his truth.
Hi, thank you very much for what all three of you presented. I have a question about something that Dr. Ellis said earlier, where she was talking about, primarily with the Constitution, that we were no doubt a Christian nation. So my question is, could you define exactly what you mean by Christian nation? And the reason I ask that, it goes back to the Paul Johnson question, the affirmation that perhaps some of the founders are deists. Greg Fraser was mentioned earlier by Dr. Stewart, and his thesis is that the founders were probably theistic rationalists. And also based upon the fact that you could make a lot of the claims in the Declaration of Independence in terms of referring to divine law, you could make those claims as a Jew and not necessarily as a Christian. So again, my question, what exactly do you mean by we were a Christian nation? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And Christian, ultimately, I think has kind of become a sort of subjective meaning. I mean, I certainly know that in the dating world, that, a guy can tell me he's Christian, but what that means, I don't know. He has to define it, right? So, so ultimately, we have to, I know, it's a stressful world out there, but pray for me. Ultimately, when we talk about Christian nation and we use that in the context that we're all here, right? But if I go out and I talk on the media, for example, to, I don't know who, I'm not going to use the term Christian nation. I'm going to use ultimately reflecting truth. And that's what C.S. Lewis describes in Mere Christianity. And even our friends who are Jews, our friends that are Catholic, our friends who are atheists, right? All of them still have to submit to truth. And that's why the founders put that word in there, that truth is discoverable. Now, I know and you know that truth is ultimately Christian, because we know that it is founded on the just inerrant word of Scripture. And so we can characterize it as a Christian nation, but I would ultimately define that term as being synonymous with truth. And we have to make sure to shape that narrative in the culture and say it's not about first claiming that the founders are Christians or winning my friend who's an atheist to be a Christian before I can advocate for truth. Truth is objective, doesn't change. Our founders recognized that. And so whether or not you're a Christian, whether or not you want to define Christianity any way you want, truth is truth, doesn't change, and we are ultimately a nation that recognizes that.
Hi. So you being political experts, and I think my question is, well, it's just hard to vote these days in elections. So I'm just wondering, what are your current thoughts on the conservative / Republican Party and its current state, and how do we as Christians navigate that?
Well, I guess the politics guy gets to answer that one. Voting is certainly a challenge, but I think we'd be fooling ourselves to think that there have not been hard choices before. Certainly, I mean, almost every time there's a presidential election, we'll hear, this is the most important election in a lifetime, right? And it is in that moment, but I think in the way that, again, John Stonestreet mentioned the last time we were together, we need to understand the bigger picture, the longer history of things. And so in some ways, we can know that even any one particular presidential election is not the end of the world. At least we hope it's not. It might depend on North Korea a little bit at this point, but we hope it's not. We should remember that we have a sovereign God. And he has appointed the authorities. This is in Romans 13 and lots of other places. God has appointed them. And so I think we can have confidence in voting. We seek God's wisdom. We try to understand the candidates, who they are and what they stand for, how they're likely to govern. Are they likely to govern in a godly fashion? And I think we can be confident in casting that vote. At the same time, we might say if neither candidate in this particular race, or maybe there are 5 or 6, like Colorado governor or whatever, I think it's okay to say, you know, I'm actually not going to cast a vote in this election because I'm not sure that either candidate is a godly candidate or will govern in a godly fashion. It's hard to gauge someone's character. Is this candidate really a Christian? We'll hear lots of reports both sides. You see their behavior in relationship to their purported faith. And we can't know that. But we can, I think, from what they've said in the past, how they've behaved in the past, we can get a sense of whether they think they'll govern in a godly fashion. That still doesn't tell you which party to vote for, whether to vote for a third party. Maybe it should tell you that maybe you should run for office.
Hello, my name is Brady. I work in the College of Adult and Graduate Studies, and I'm also in the Organizational Leadership Program, where we're kind of wrestling through this post-Christian, what many researchers and people are talking about, the era we're in. My question relates specifically to religious freedom and how we can conserve this divine law and the biblical authority and still join hands and advocate for, I can't think about this topic without Islam and Judaism. And it seems like the perfect opportunity for an interfaith model to take politics aside, to take these things aside. And I think it'd be a much agreeable message across the nation if we were to join hands and use an interfaith model to fight for this religious freedom. Because I think those people that don't submit to the Christian worldview, they have a challenge with the idea of religious freedom because they think of it as Christian freedom. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's also a great question. And so we have to, along with our fundamental premise of truth, then recognize that God ordained what are ultimately 3 spheres of government. One is civil, one is the church, and one is the family. They play very different roles in society, and they ultimately are subject and submissive to God's ultimate authority. What our founders recognize in what I like to call the triad of first freedoms, which is our freedom of speech, our freedom of association, and our freedom of religion. They are not compelling us to believe in the Christian worldview. The civil government is ultimately established to preserve and protect my freedom and liberty, to discover that truth, to go to church, to speak with my fellow man about God and further that conversation. And so without freedom of speech, I couldn't talk. Without freedom of association, we couldn't gather here. And without freedom of religion, we couldn't talk about the subject matter of God and divine law. And so the founders didn't set up religious liberty to mean we're compelling you to believe. That's actually the one freedom and the one inherent right that the Supreme Court has acknowledged is absolute. I can believe, that there are tons of little green men on Mars right now. Nobody's going to stop me from it. What they foreclose is certain actions based on belief. And that's what the criminal code is all about, right? Is saying if you choose to commit this type of action, then we will punish that after the fact. And so the right to believe is very important, but we have to understand the nature of religious liberty. And we have to understand that within this wonderful context that our founders gave us, they understood the limitations of our civil government. It's not our government's job to compel us, to require us to believe in the Christian worldview, but on the flip side, there is no license for our civil government to act contrary to that truth. So when we are engaging in religious liberty discussions, we have to talk about why the First Amendment is so important and not just focus on establishment of religion or the religious freedom nature, but talk about why that's important in our triad of first freedoms.
Sorry, I would just add something else again from church history. I don't know if you've ever read Augustine's City of God, but he lays out very clearly how individual believers should think about being citizens both of the city of man, sort of human society, but also in the city of God. I think he helps us navigate a little bit that question of how do we both work with those, how we seek the good of the city that we're in, promote the earthly peace of the city of man where we are, engage in interfaith dialogue, protect religious freedom and so on, and yet how do we maintain our saltiness? How do we still maintain that heavenly perspective, knowing the truth, knowing where we're going? And so I think those interfaith conversations need to be had. I think we should make common cause with other faiths where possible in the political realm, and yet always be clear that we know there's a gospel, and the folks who don't believe in the gospel still need that. And so it's difficult to navigate, but lots of folks in church history have thought about this, from Augustine in the two cities to Luther and Calvin. The Anabaptist tradition has their own view. I don't agree that we should separate ourselves from society. I think we need to be here, be in society and be salt and light. But there may be some additional things, I think, from church tradition that can be helpful in thinking about that. Yeah. I think we have time for one more question.
God as we know him. Thank you. Truth and God as we know him. And so this question comes from that. Don't those who do not share the same views on, let's say, marriage, still deserve the civil liberties associated with the union that all Americans experience in marriage?
Nominated again. Okay. That's also a great question. And that's where we have to, again, recognize what is the purpose and function of the civil government and what legitimate authority does it have. And to give all human beings, all citizens, all residents that are within the jurisdiction of the United States certain privileges and protections, absolutely. And to understanding, for example, can a person who is gay have the same right to purchase a house? Well, sure, because that's not based on any Christian understanding of marriage. What I think we failed to do is properly define marriage in the context of the church and understand how these three spheres work in tandem but are also separate. And that's, by the way, what Jefferson actually meant by separation of church and state, not that the two don't overlap sometimes, but that they are two just very different spheres, just like the family isn't the civil government. The parent does not have the power of capital punishment or the death penalty. Neither does the church. And so, and that's probably a good thing. So we have to understand what the civil government is trying to do is to benefit the family government and also the church government. And we have to recognize that marriage is already predefined by our supreme authority, and that marriage is between one man and one woman, and that doesn't change. Now, again, the right to believe is fine. You can believe that marriage is anything different, but when you try to ultimately change the civil government into doing something illegitimate, now you've gone against our supreme authority. And our churches, unfortunately, have completely abdicated all of their scriptural authority to the civil government. Parents and family have done much the same thing. And so our civil government has become so incredibly powerful because we've ceased to recognize that separation of powers. I think it's interesting, we have three branches of government and we have three different spheres of God's authority. A separation of powers is ultimately a good thing, but the civil government cannot go against God's ultimate authority. Otherwise, like Romans 13 says, it's now illegitimate.